So now we go south. We go to Australia. So I think Lars mentioned this briefly, but in my introduction for Suhanya, I only identified her as occupying a very important position in this institution, Art Gallery of New South Wales in Sydney. But it's a relatively new position that you have taken up just about a year or so.
Yes, that's
and
right.
So before that, she spent almost 2 decades at now called Queensland Art Gallery and Gallery of Modern Art in Brisbane, which perhaps isn't as well known as New York or London or Sydney. Well, maybe now because there was G20 just now, so maybe you have heard about it. But I don't think it's as well-known cultural center or hub.
No, I think not, but that was an advantage.
Okay, so then
for us at the time. So when Dorian invited me, he told me I had to speak with 2 hats. So I will do that. Talking about Queensland Art Gallery, Gallery of Modern Art in Brisbane and the work that I did there. And then touching on the Art Gallery of New South Wales in Sydney. Sydney, of course, is the global city of Australia. Whenever you go outside in the world and ask anybody, what do you know about Australia, they usually say the Opera House, which is a wonderful thing. There's a piece of architecture that is identified with a place. But also Sydney, and Sydney is a global city of the nation. But Brisbane was a sleepy, sleepy town when I went up there. And I'll take a little step back to give you a sense of the history of why I'm here to talk to you about what we did there at, and continue to do. I don't do it there, but others are. 20 years ago, the Queensland Art Gallery was really a very provincial, regional gallery in that sense. It had collections that were very much based on Australian art, but Australian art concentrating on Queensland art. And there was a change of director. Doug Hall came on board. There was a president of trustees called Richard Austin, who had spent time in Japan and had a very strong connection to that country. The state had just undergone a huge change in its politics from being a very, very conservative, rural-based party and had become very corrupt, and the federal government had done a lot of work to undo that corruption, and the people of Queensland had voted in Wayne Goss, who kind of changed the whole structure of how culture, the arts, education, health, all of that operated in that state. And federally we had Paul Keating, who had, on the heels of Hawke and Whitlam before him, had a mandate to look at the Asia Pacific in a very particular way. And so within Australia, Queensland decided to take up that challenge of looking at its region as a project, and it did this through a triennial called the Asia Pacific Triennial of Contemporary Art, the first of which was in 1993.
And you were there from the very beginning.
I was there from the very beginning. So this is what the gallery looks like. It was built in the early 80s, and unlike the Art Gallery of New South Wales, which has a 143-year history now, this is much newer. And like M+, perhaps, there was the opportunity of a blank page. And what it did was the triennial, and it's very unusual that an exhibition project starts to define an institution and a collection, which is what happened.
And then Queensland Art Gallery built Gallery of Modern Art. And when was that?
That was 2006. And the Gallery of Modern Art was built really on the heels of the triennial being so successful and a number of artworks coming into the collection, and of course collections grow and they need more space. What was also interesting about the triennial was that it was always working with living artists and working in a very site-specific way with those artists. So maybe we can look at a image like this, which is from the first triennial, Dadang Kristanto's very moving performance-based installation looking at the history of violence in Indonesia and ethnic violence as much as the character of that violence. So the title for those who are poor, who are suffering, who are oppressed, who are voiceless, and so on, was an installation made in '93 that involved the participation of audiences. So right very early on, inviting the audience into the gallery, inviting the artist into the gallery, making a collection with artists that were totally unknown at the time and believing in their work.
So not only the artists were not known, but I guess you can also say that 20 years ago, there isn't much of Indonesian art scene, or rather market or scene of institutions that we're beginning to hear about. So that also has impact on curators' research and travel and whatnot.
Yeah. So in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, the thing to say is that in each of those places, there are very active, rich artistic practices. We just didn't know about it. And what we did in Queensland was to establish a very complex curatorial roundtable with a series of co-curators and curatorial committees, enormous research, and investing in curators in the institution to go out and do research and work with colleagues to learn about work that was happening in those very specific regions. The first APT in '93 looked at, what is Asia, what is Pacific in the context of a project. In the first APT, it was really looking at the countries that hugged the coast of Australia, very, very immediate countries. So by the second APT, people were saying, well, how can you do Asia without doing India? How can you how can you not consider that a fountainhead culture of Asia if you're looking at China, Japan, New Zealand, Indonesia? So by the second APT, this is the second APT, we invited and worked with Chiang, made a major gunpowder drawing called Dragon or Rainbow Serpent, a myth glorified or feared. And this is one of his projects for extraterrestrials. Sai, of course, is an artist who is very interested in the place, a location. He worked very closely with our Aboriginal curators and was interested to bring out the synergies between the serpent, the dragon, and the rainbow serpent. The rainbow serpent is a creation myth story, very, very much part of Aboriginal thinking about how culture lives. You could think about the rainbow serpent. The rainbow serpent is, I think it's water as much as spiritual energy. And water, of course, in Australia is rare. It's not always plentiful. It's a dry continent. So the Brisbane River is the site of a rainbow serpent as well. And the river became a very important part of this work where Sai based his dragon rainbow serpent with. So it was a very interesting project for the gallery to undertake and make, and opened up conversations with other artists in Brisbane at the time. So over the first decade, this very complex curatorial conversation really, I think, imploded by 1999. There were more curators than there were artists in the show.
That's known to happen all too frequently.
So
before that?
Yeah, so by 2002, which is when we started to work with Liu Fan, there was a radical shift and change in the project. So the first decade saw the Queensland Art Gallery work in extremely collaborative way with regional curators, critics, academics, and advisors. And we felt that after a decade of coming and going to the region, that there was enough knowledge now to establish a different kind of exhibition project. Doing a triennial, of course, gives you an excellent basis of returning, going back every 3 years to do research and make something of that. In 2002, we decided to show the work of 17 artists, but in great depth, because we also realized through our research with our audiences that they had grown to love the project, but they just assumed that contemporary Asia Pacific art came out of thin air in the 90s. And so the proposal in 2002 was to base a curatorial idea around 4 very senior artists, Liu Fan, Yayoi Kusama, Namjoon Paik, and Ralph Hotare, all of whom had very international global practices as well as work that was deeply rooted in their regional locations or their national backgrounds.
I mean, just to sort of give a little more information on that, specifically with regards to Liu Fan, for those of you who don't know who that is, of course, this is an artist who's now in his late 70s, born in Korea, but moved to Japan early on and became a very critical figure starting late 60s on for half a century in both countries. And also, interestingly, now
and he was a founder of MoMA.
Exactly. And the MoMA was already mentioned in relation to Italian arte povera movement in Francis's presentation, and flashed an image of the 1974 painting by Liu Fan that is in the MoMA collection. And so now, not only he's part of the collections of these 2 important institutions, but of course he had a career retrospective at the Guggenheim, but that was 2011. So you were doing this already 10 years before that, but this is also showing the result of your long-term relationship up to that point already.
I should also say that all of these works you're seeing now are in the collection. So the collecting began right in the early 90s, and it's a really fascinating project to think about, that a major exhibition, a triennial that comes out of a collecting institution, has defined that institution, but also defined the character of what that collection is as well. So we can look at a couple of other images here. Sungdung, this is also from the 2002 triennial. The performance is something that has sat very much in the center of the exhibition, and it continues to. And the architecture of the site has been something that artists have responded to. Maybe the next slide, yeah. So Harry Donor here making his angels. I put a number of these slides together that showed artists at work in the institution, because really, unlike MoMA and Tate, where we are looking at objects, it's very nice to be looking at an institution that's working directly with artists, because the artist's presence in the institution alters the way that institution actually behaves. And what it meant was that artists also want to make new work. That's a challenge often for a collecting institution. You think about, well, how do you manage that within the Biennale context? It's expected, and that's the way forward. So what happens when those 2 things exist together inside? It means that the institution has to respond and move in different ways. It made a series of amazing acquisitions that are deeply site-specific. The site in both the Gallery of Modern Art and the Queensland Art Gallery have big spaces. So there's a lot of big work, But that said,
Such
there
as
are
this year,
yeah.
Kusama Infinity Room.
Yes, but the other thing to say is that the collection itself doesn't consist of just those sorts of work. There's a whole lot of other work that goes around it, where the collection is built around these key groups of work that have come in.
So a more recent example would be works such as this one by Iranian artist, but you know, she's not a new discovery, right? I mean, she's now in her 80s. So
that's right. She's a very senior artist. In her, you know, she was 80 when I worked with her. But I think Francis was saying that Monier's work is collected at the Tate from a much earlier period. So I know that for Monier, it was, she said it was great for her to be taken up as a contemporary artist, as an artist who's making new work right now, and in the context of a group of other West Asian artists that we were showing in this triennial. So I thought we could move on next to how the collection, you know, sure, it had these major works that came in, but how you then work with it as a collecting institution, not just a triennial. And we did I curated a project called the China Project that looked at 3 different exhibitions under the umbrella of the China Project. The first was called 3 Decades, Contemporary Chinese Art from the Collection. And the decades were the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s. And this brought together a group of work that told that story from the point of view of Australia. We collected the book From the Sky in 1994. It had come to Australia as part of an exhibition that Claire Roberts had curated called New Art from China Post-Mao Product. It had been seen in Sydney at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and then it travelled to Brisbane. And because by then the ambition in the institution was to start working very closely with the work of the Asia Pacific, a work like this felt absolutely right to come into the collection, and it came in at that time. These are just some other examples of work from that collection and that exhibition.
Well, you say just some other examples, but these are, of course, the giants in the history of contemporary Chinese painting, art, especially. Yes. But it's really remarkable to note the dates of 80s, because this really, I mean, these are the moments before they developed their signature style that became such explosive. In the market, right? So
and you know, importantly, because Queensland had been working with these artists from the early 90s, by the time we did the China Project, which was 2009, and we did make acquisitions towards that exhibition, artists wanted to be in that collection within that context. So it became possible for us to acquire work that would otherwise be impossible to afford. The second arm of the China Project was a solo show of Zhang Zhaogang, who also, we showed 30 years of his work. It was a major retrospective going right back to the 80s. And 2 reasons to work with Zhang Zhaogang. One, he was an artist who didn't leave China, he stayed. And second, I was really interested to see what is his work that is not just what everybody thought of as the market and these millions of dollars being paid for the big family pictures. Very, very wonderful project. He came and did an incredible artist talk with a number of other artists that came for the exhibition, and talked about a 30-year practice and what it meant. And he spoke about a particular series of works called Amnesia and Memory. And he contextualized it in terms of how an artist works through, you know, periods of history that are challenging and difficult, and how does an artist pursue a career and hold on to the need to be an artist. And he talked about forgetting as a way, amnesia as a way of surviving, and that at another stage you have to remember to survive as well. It was very, very moving that he was so honest about his experience.
Right. And then it was also very important for you to include the aspect of or perspective from Chinese Australian.
That's right. So not only were there artists who'd come to Australia post 89, and there are a number of those in that project, but there's also the big history of Australia with China. And so William Yang, we showed work by him because he's a third generation Australian coming from North Queensland. And he talked about coming out as a Chinese as part of his evolution as an artist, even though, he's an Australian. His parents were Australians. His grandparents were first generation Chinese. So long history of the Chinese in Australia. So that's just an example of how Queensland Art Gallery displayed collections.
Yeah, no, that's a really good segue to the next. It's rather unfair to talk about the 20 years of work at this institution in 20 minutes, but we should get to the next institution as we promised, which of course looks very different.
Very different. So I joined the Art Gallery of New South Wales just over a year ago as the Director of Collections, and hugely different history, 140 plus year institution. You can see from its architecture, sandstone, neoclassical facade. It comes from that 19th century idea of collections, and curators are keepers, they're holders. It's a fort to keep people in. And one of our great galleries in the Art Gallery of New South Wales is the Schaefer Gallery of 19th century European art. It's modeled really on the Dulwich Picture Gallery, and it has pictures in there of, fabulous, Leighton, Ford Madox Brown. In fact, the Ford Madox Brown painting there, the big work there, was the first acquisition that the Art Gallery of New South Wales made that was not Australian. And it's its first international acquisition, made within 5 years of the work being made in the late 1860s. So, it's a very, very, very different history that is that I've arrived at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and I'm thrilled to be there, really.
But I think the next slide is going to really throw people off.
Yeah. So I actually began our conversations with M+ yesterday with this slide, really, because in many ways it tells you or it helps understand how Queensland Art Gallery could do what it did with the Asia Pacific Triennial. So who is this? This is Tony Tuckson, who became the Art Gallery of New South Wales Deputy Director in 1950. He was an artist himself and an avid collector of work from Aboriginal Australia and a traveller into Papua New Guinea. And he's here with Stan Moriarty, who was his great friend and mate who he travelled with. What Tuckson did was, the natural history museums, the ethnography museums in Australia collected Aboriginal art and Torres Strait Islander art. But what Tuckson did was, if you can just go to the next slide, was work with the Tiwi people of Melville Island in the north to commission a group of burial poles for the art gallery. And it was a major commission that was realized in 1958. And with that commission, Tuckson brought Aboriginal art into the art gallery. And from that moment, in the late 50s, all Australian art museums have collected and shown Aboriginal art as art.
So this wasn't very different from what you did at Queensland
No.
Art Museum, working for
That's right.
commissions.
That's
and
right.
then you could almost say that you said the Ford Madox Brown was purchased just 5 years after it was making,
Yeah.
which means that it was very much contemporary at that time,
Yeah.
just as this was contemporary at that time.
That's right. But what was very important in terms of what Tucson did was open up a different way of thinking about what art is and how art history is thought about in an art institution, especially in Australia. Because if the Tate started its international collecting in 1950, what was happening in the Art Museum in Australia was that it was suddenly looking inside, deeply inside. The Art Gallery of New South Wales collections of Australian art are its biggest holdings of in terms of the collection, but it sets a kind of a perspective, a framework to think internally and regionally. So the internationally suddenly became much closer to home in a very, very significant way. Not Britain and Europe, but inside. And I think that's a really important thing to say in terms of work that has happened within the Australian museum sector, the Art Museum. Because Tucson, just with that commission, altered everything.
So now one of the things that you initiated at this new place, which had that interesting, I guess almost multi-layered understanding of what contemporary is as a nation goes through its, I guess, evolution of self-definition, right? But then now there's also within your museum this collection of traditional Asian objects, which I guess were collected when Australia wasn't necessarily thinking about itself in relation to Asia Pacific.
Well, I guess Art Gallery of New South Wales was thinking of itself in a much more traditional encyclopedic museum context. And so the Asian collections were being collected in that manner. I was brought into the art gallery with the mandate to start thinking more broadly about the international as well, you know, because the international had been very much at the art gallery, great collections of European art and pre-modern Asian art, but where does the contemporary sit within that? So I initiated a rehang of the Asian collections, which hadn't been rehung in 13 odd years, and looked at the collection as well as new acquisitions. And we might just go to the next slide, using the lens of artists. And these are all, you know, Anish Kapoor, Shazia Sikandar, Ai Weiwei, Geijin Fujita from, you know, Los Angeles, Japanese artist, Tim Johnson, a local Australian artist, Ashian, Chinese, Australian, Kadim Ali, Afghani artist now living in Sydney, Ai Yamaguchi, Japanese artist, Rodney Glick. I just thought I'd show you artists, and this is our last slide, to say that for me, one of the greatest pleasures, yes, but challenges as well as a significant part of curatorial practice had been working with artists. And I wanted to bring that to the art gallery. And so initiating conversations through the Asian collections was a way of doing that. And what these artists have done are work directly with the historical collections and talk about the relationship of their practice to those collections.
Well, as curators, you know, our main job, of course, is to work with artists, or we won't have any job if we didn't have artists. And the museums are the same, right? They won't exist if artists weren't there. So I think it's a perfect image to end this conversation, not just for us, but all three conversations. Thank you, Suhanya.
Thank you.